Is that working?
Hello, can you hear me, Oliver?
I can hear you. Hi.
Cool. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. It's good to speak to somebody.
Yeah, right. Is this the first conversation of the day for you?
It is actually, yeah. Yeah, it is, yeah. Yeah,
Nice.
it's been a long confinement here
Oh,
at
really?
last. Yeah. How about for
Great.
you? How are things? Where are you based?
I'm in Maine, which is in the northeast corner of the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, it's this state that everybody forgets about. It used to be part of the state of Massachusetts, 100 and something years ago, but they said we're independent and we split off and became their own state up here.
All
So.
right, okay.
Well, I've got you. I started recording and everything, so I just wanted to introduce a little bit. My guest today here on the Blue Continent podcast is Oliver Nieburg of the Luminaire Institute
Luminar Intelligence.
Lumina
Yeah,
Intelligence, Lumina Intelligence. I got to check my notes every once in a while.
no
Um,
problem.
and you're also the host of the Food and Drink Sustainability Podcast, Sustainable Food and Drink Podcast. And frequently on your show, you're talking about the food supply chain sustainability, how things are produced and distributed, and how just how these can be acquired in a less impactful way on the environment. Talking about that in great detail with your numerous guests. How long have you been doing that show?
I think we ran the first episode in, I think it was 2000, and I want to say the end of 2018. There was a trip to Ecuador, and there was an interview with the Export Association, the president of the Export Association in the Cocoa Association in Ecuador, and I think that was the very first episode with very. I didn't have any equipment at that point, so it was very very poor sound quality.
Yeah. Did you decided that the material that you'd acquired and everything you'd experienced was so important to get out there that you created the podcast around that?
Well, I think there were issues that we were cover. I was editor of a trade publication in the confectionery industry, and we have other publications that we run, and they're typically in written format. And we produce some videos as well, but the podcasts were just growing in popularity. I listened to lots of podcasts myself, and just wanted to give it a try. Really, I mean, how did yours come to be?
Mine came to be because I'd been actually, I wanted to there's a lot of things I wanted to cover on that, because when I was reading about you, I saw that you'd studied journalism and at the City University in London, and specifically in conflict journalism. And
Yeah,
was it the conflict of social conflict, or do you mean like violent conflict? What was it that you focused on there?
it was sort of war journalism. So that kind of conflict, and it was a little by chance how I ended up doing what I'm doing now. So I originally studied law and was thinking about
Hmm.
becoming a lawyer, but um, then later studied journalism. I did a few uh, small research jobs in volunteer jobs in Sierra Leone and in South Africa, and then I still wanted to stay in the domain of journalism and hopefully do something in conflict journalism. And there was a job offer to actually go to Iraq, Kurdistan, to work for a news agency there, or there was a job working in the south of France and covering the food industry. So I don't know, maybe I chickened out. And I've
Or,
ended
I
up
mean, one
here.
was a real compelling attraction there. Who wouldn't want to go study food in France, right?
Yeah, and I mean, when I say that to a lot of people, they're thinking that I'm some kind of food or wine critic covering, restaurants, and that's just not at all what I do. It's real, B2B journalism, people working at Nestle and Mars.
Hmm.
It's that kind of audience, really. Um,
If you really ever wanted to make up for what you missed out there, you could take everything that you learned about the food industry and supply chain and then go and write about food in Iraq, right now. I'm sure they'd love to have you.
Yeah, I don't know how big the chocolate industry is in Iraq, or how important that will be in the scale of things at the moment.
It's a good question. I've had Arabic chocolate before, you know, there's some kind of a taste for it there. They have their own specific taste. So is that how you got into food sustainability?
I mean, in a way, and as I started working on those food and drink industry publications, just writing more about the industry and going to some of the industry events, you just discover that there are two sides to the industry. So on one hand, there was the glamorous side where you're going to National Confectioners Association events which are they're now held at Trump resorts in
Oh,
Miami, and you go to these giant trade shows where they're promoting joy and how candy brings great happiness to humanity, and how it's creating lots of jobs and economic growth. At these trade shows you have the mascots in big bear costumes running around who are giving out free candy. You go there with an empty suitcase and you leave the hero back in the office with lots of candy. You go to press trips and you put up in
yeah.
ridiculous hotels and for these press launches, and you think there's a lot of money in this
Oh,
this industry.
sure.
So there's that one kind of happy, glamorous side to things, and then I discovered there was a whole other side to it too.
Yeah, everything else, right?
Yeah.
So can you give a kind of rundown for the listener who maybe is not obviously somebody who hasn't been a subscriber to your show yet? We'll certainly encourage them too. What are some of the main issues in the well, let's start with the cocoa industry.
In cocoa, there are currently, I'd say, really three main issues that remain. Poverty is still, quite widespread. There have been minimal studies on the extent of poverty in the sector. There was one a couple of years ago by Barry Callebaut. They're the world's largest chocolate producer that supply Mars, Nestle, and any other sort of big name chocolate manufacturer that we'd all know. And that found that on average, a farmer is earning around 90 US cents a day, and they're typically operating on these small farm sizes, typically aged around 55, not far from the life expectancy in many of the countries that it's where cocoa is grown, and it's a very consolidated crop in its geography, which originated in Latin America, but now is 70% grown in West Africa, and primarily in two countries in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, where sub-Saharan Africa is the hotbed for poverty. And a lot of people who are in poverty and living in sub-Saharan Africa are working in agriculture, and they're working in cocoa. So poverty is I'd say the main issue. And
Have
then
you spent time in Cote d'Ivoire?
yes, and it's typically been for press events, or for conferences, where you go to see a few plantations, and you're never quite sure if you're seeing, are these the best ones? Are they showing me the average ones? And it's
Right.
but I've been in a mix, and you can tell that even if these are supposedly the best ones, that it's there's cocoa pods strewn everywhere. It's old men in kind of disheveled clothing, working in this ridiculously hot heat, and for what must be what all the studies suggest are around 90 cents a day. And
Oh my God.
you can't think, how is that fair?
Yeah.
um
It
and
seems to you seem very affected by it. Yeah.
yeah, I definitely am. It brought back a lot of the inequality that I'd seen when I first did that volunteer work when I was and I'm still relatively young now, but when I was younger, I probably didn't fully take it in.
Mm.
And when you start to understand some of the the business elements to it,
Yeah.
and the amount of profit that people are making from what is a multi-billion-dollar industry, it does break your heart a little bit. And
Yeah.
the poverty leads to other things. Poverty is the main, I'd say, the what underpins all the rest of the problems. But that leads to widespread child labor, which the industry has tried to tackle over the last 10 to 15 years. Have made promises, maybe didn't fully appreciate the full extent of the problem,
What are
and
they
how
doing to
entrenched.
tackle it?
Well, in and don't quote me on the dates, but I think it was in around 2005 that they signed what was the Harkin-Engel Protocol. So there was a couple of Dutch journalists who I think they were the ones who went to found Tony's chocolonely, which has started to grow. But basically, they unearthed that there was widespread child labor, but at that time there weren't really any studies to know how widespread there was. And we say child labor, it's a very loaded term. There were different levels of child labor. When we talk about the worst forms of child labor, that's people who are deprived, children who are deprived of schooling, who are working with agrochemicals or lifting heavy loads. That's the worst form of child labor, when they're missing school and doing those kind of dangerous activities. There's another element to child work where they're helping their parents outside of schooling hours.
Right.
So the industry at that time, and I think it was around 2005, 2006, but I checked those dates, that the Harkin-Engel Protocol was signed by in the early days of the National Confectioners Association, which I think at that point had a different name. And that was the task, was to end child labor in all its forms, including those worst, especially those worst forms, which
Particularly
can.
ironic, though, especially in the chocolate industry, that chocolate is something that brings joy to children all over the world, and then they're the ones that are sacrificing their lives to produce this product in some cases.
I mean, I completely agree, and there is an element of responsibility for the industry, but there is an element of responsibility also for governments, and also for people that are purchasing those products, albeit without maybe the full knowledge of what's going on behind them.
Yeah.
But the industry signed that Harkin-Engel Protocol, which basically said to end child labor in all its forms by around 10. I think it was around 5 to 10 years, and that deadline was pushed. It was pushed, and it came to 2020, and frankly, it's not been met at all. There's been the Tulane University, which conducted studies on the extent of child labor in every 5 years. It's now a different unit. I think it's the University of Chicago now that's conducting the study, because it got a little bit political. But each year, in the 3 times it's been conducted, every 5 years, it's shown a rise in absolute child labor. It's shown a rise in the worst forms in what it calls hazardous child labor, which are the forms that we were speaking about. And we're talking there about 1.3 million children, and that's just in the 2 countries that
So
make up
when they
most of the
signed
problem.
this agreement back in 2005, 2006, the industry giants, did they promise to any specific body, international body, that this would be done and there would be consequences, or is it completely non-binding, gentleman's agreement?
I think it was non-binding, and it was in lieu of regulation, more stringent regulation that would compel them to do something within a time limit. So it allowed the industry more time to deal with the issues, and but it largely went under the radar, because the manufacturers themselves, they're more marketing bodies, and they sales and marketing organizations. While on the face of it, they're what everyone knows and recognizes. It's through the likes of Cargill, Barry Callebaut, and Blommer, and Olam, and others, where the cocoa is an e-com, and the cocoa it's really flowing, and they have a maybe a closer interaction with their supply chain, but still they don't know all of the people who are behind it. There's not full traceability because the individual smallholder farmer they'll sell on to in Cote d'Ivoire with a Pisteur or a Traiton, which are these small traders, and there may be a paper receipt, there may not be, that may be lost somewhere along the lines. So there's no trail of where that came from. There's no accountability for those volumes of cocoa. There's nothing to know what happened on that farm for that specific, bag of cocoa. Where did it come from? And, for still quite a large portion of the large players' supply chains, they still don't know where some of it comes
One
from.
of the things that's been happening in supply chains, which are really fascinating. In fact, there's a great podcast called Supply Chain Revolution, which I follow. They have a lot of interesting guests with great ideas. But anyway, that a lot of places are now using what do you call them? Not the technology behind Bitcoin, for example, blockchain technology to track supply chains now, and they can see where everything is going and where it's originating. For example, I don't know if that's a possible piece of technology to be incorporated that could help find out where the real offensive activity is happening. Or do you think that maybe a solution is for countries either unilaterally or bilaterally in their trade negotiations with a country like Cote d'Ivoire, they say, look, you've got to crack down on this and not permit it, or else it'll affect your trade status with our country,
I think it's probably a combination of both of those things. On the blockchain, what companies are starting to do in the portion of the supply chain where they do have more a direct relationship with the farmers, they're starting to roll out mobile technology, which can have its challenges because there are many farmers who are illiterate and they don't follow the mobile technology or don't have no trust in the people that are providing it. There are some blockchain powered technologies that have been developed that they're based on shapes, which I found quite interesting, that can be used even by illiterate farmers. And they're starting to tell farmers when the best time to harvest will be to reduce spoilage and crop loss, and to best mitigate against things like cocoa swirl and shoot virus, which is like the coronavirus of the cocoa world, and give updates on weather and try to move to digital money. These things are starting to happen, but in a very small way. They're pilots to see if they will work before they're being rolled out. But I think it's encouraging because it's mobile technology. You can pick up those smartphones for around $50, and if you have maybe a couple of field agents also interacting with those farmers at the same time, it's a relatively low cost way to try and address some of those issues. So I think blockchain and mobile technology definitely has a role to play. Another role is also child labor monitoring systems, which I think they're starting to be rolled out more widely by companies, but they're still in that organized part of the supply chain where the industry has links to a cooperative, that basically there'll be a local person that they appoint to be a child labor agent. So they'll conduct household interviews with say I think it's every 6 months or so with the farmer and with the children, to see if there's any child labor happening. And it's not a kind of punitive approach if it's found, which is quite common. It's found, and companies are reporting it in their thousands. They're reporting each year that they're finding 30,000 plus cases among the big players. So companies are no longer, I'd say, shy to the fact that they're finding it.
So
and then once they have found it, then they can do something to try and address the issue on why it's happening. It could be that there's no school. It could be that the child needs a birth certificate to attend the school.
Does it happen? How do you think that the cocoa industry and its use of child labor stacks up against other major agricultural enterprises in the developing world? Do you think that it's a worse situation in that industry? Obviously, it's terrible, but is it worse than other industries in those areas?
I think it's not particularly well documented the extent of child labor in other sectors. I think one thing that definitely goes against cocoa is that the plot size, the plantation sizes are very low, which means you can only get so much out of the land, and particularly in places like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, the prices are set by government, and the premiums on top of those prices, which either come from fair trade certification or from a company program, will only add so much to the to the income, which means, and labor is employing labor to prune your crop and at harvest times is one of the biggest outlays. And if you don't have that income, then you can get a family member to help you do it, I think. But in other crops, there just aren't enough studies looking at some of the incomes in coffee. You'd have to think that, and it really depends in coffee, because in coffee, in Brazilian coffee, the farm sizes, they're quite large. But if you look at other places like in Kenya, they're tiny plot sizes, and the incomes look, on the face of it, even worse than cocoa. So you have to wonder, is the same thing happening there? And there just haven't been any widespread studies on it.
So here's what's always seemed to me, and I hope this isn't dull to the listener, but I've always been fascinated by the idea of commodities markets, right? So you look at a commodity like this, and the price for it is set typically by who sets the price on coffee, on cocoa, who sets it?
It's there are two main stock exchanges, the London and the New York Stock Exchange, and they're dictated by supply and demand.
But at
but
the same time, the way that we compare fair trade, it's off on its own. But there's a difference in the quality coming from one place or another, and how it's raised and how they take care of people. How is it that what could be done to raise the prices on these commodities so that people are paid fairly? Just overall, just how could you make a dent in that?
I think it would probably go back to something that you were hinting at earlier, and it would be regulation compelling industry to do so. One of the things that's really been lacking is hard data on from individual companies how many people are living below the poverty line in their individual supply chain, not as the industry as a whole, but for that company. There's very little tracking and monitoring and accountability on that. So if legislation, the EU or the US, were to say that if the root cause of all of these other problems like deforestation and child labor are poverty issues, because the majority of people are living on 90 cents a day, then if you had legislation that would compel companies and monitor and check with KPIs on poverty, so to know how many people you have in your household. Say I'm a large chocolate manufacturer, I map out my supply chain. I find out how many, on an individual farmer basis, how many people each farmer has in their household. How much income do they get from cocoa? How much do they get from other sources? Companies are starting to do that with the mobile technology data that they're using, but they're only doing it currently as a small scale and don't have that data. Or if they have that data, they're not reporting it. And it could be that it's not happy reading. It's likely to be a lot of people living in extreme poverty.
I imagine they don't collect that data because having it would be a liability.
You'd have to, yeah.
Yeah.
It could, well, some are reporting it. Barry Callebaut has started to report it. Mondelez has started to report it for some origins. There'll be sort of small scale studies from some others. So they'll report it in some way, but there's no kind of organized fashion. You'd kind of hope that would come from a sustainability trade organization that, you know, represents the
So
whole, to say,
are you part of any strong sustainability trade organizations that you'd like to give a shout out to?
I'm not part of any of those organizations. We have some kind of partnerships with them where we share some data to analyze. But no, I'm not part of anyone, so I can't give any publicity, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, I am actually involved with a company, a Norwegian company called ACT, which is a cooperatively owned company there. And what they do is they've devised this software that helps to identify the sustainability quotient or the ecological impact of everything you're buying as a shopper when you go to the market. If you're going to say, oh, I'm going to buy one tomato or another tomato, and you can see which one was grown in a more sustainable way versus otherwise, and probably what the carbon footprint is. Anyway, they're actually launching next month, I believe, or at least by July. I was wondering if I put you in touch with our CEO, if he might be a good guest on your show, just talking about sustainable foods, because that's his passion. He's been working on this for 5 years and has a great team behind him. But anyway, I think it would coincide with the launch pretty well in that way.
Yeah.
Just a little self promo here, you know.
Put me in contact.
All right, I will do that. I was going to ask you a little bit. You didn't quite get to the total environmental impact of the cocoa industry, and I know deforestation is a big problem there as well, creating space for that. Can I give you a chance? Because I think at the beginning you said there were like 3 impacts. There was one of the absolute poverty, and then there's
I
the
went off
child
on a big
labor.
tangent and didn't mention the last one.
Yeah, that was the last one. So if you want to go into that.
And one of the other consequences of poverty has meant that on small farm sizes, what is one way to increase your income? It's to plot out more land. A lot of the cocoa grows 30 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator in tropical regions where you have a lot of tropical forests, some of the most diverse forests in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. And it's only been over the last, say, 3 to 4 years that reports have started to emerge of widespread deforestation of swathes of forest loss in Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire losing almost close to half of its forest reserves in the last 50 years as a result of cocoa, one of which is the knock-on effects of poverty. So that's meant that industry and the governments in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and now Colombia have tried to come together to address the issue with it's kind of divided into 3. So it's training again, it's access to materials, there's no sourcing from particular areas, but there's currently not full traceability. There's a commitment to get to full traceability, but how you'd know that those materials aren't coming from banned forest areas without knowing where the materials come from in the first place is a little bit beyond me. But and then there's also a social and community aspect to it, where you've tried to form loan associations, sort of microfinance, so farmers can get credit for investment on their farms. But again, it's a little bit early to tell how effective that's going to be. Some of the satellite mapping data had shown that deforestation had continued, and you would worry about the effects of coronavirus on some of those initiatives to get people to map the farm. Part of it is mapping the farm boundaries, so farmers aren't further expanding into forested areas, and you worry about getting boots on the ground to do that with social distancing measures. In the meanwhile, it may be difficult for farmers to sell their crops in the current climate, and that may mean further reduced income in subsistence living to support a family, which could mean further encroachment. I seem like a bit of a doom and gloom, but
sounds awful.
companies and the institutions behind the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, it's called, have come out and said, they remain committed to it. And I think there seems definitely appetite that it won't go the same way as the Harkin-Engel protocol that we talked about on child
Right.
labor, which has been largely, completely ineffective. But I do worry that it doesn't get to the crux of the poverty issue. There's nothing, it's a set of measures that are designed to lift farmers out of poverty and closer to a living income, but there's no obligation on companies to actually track if that's happening. And I think that's one of the
It's
pitfalls
terrible.
of the system.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's terrible. I mean, so if you see hope in the future of the industry, where do you see it? And if it's in the fair trade movement, or any teeth to legislation of some kind, and what can people do about it as well?
I've mixed feelings on fair trade. For starters, I think it helps build cooperatives which will increase farmers' bargaining power. They'll get a slight premium, but in many cases that premium will not be enough to lift them out of poverty. There's only really this is in cocoa anyway, only really the fair trade premium, which was only revised, I think towards the tail end of last year, only that slightly lifts the average farmer who in Cote d'Ivoire living on with, I think it's a plot size of about four hectares, with a average family of around six people per household, only just marginally moves them out of above $1.90 a day. The others, well, firstly, that they may not communicate the premiums that they're paying at all, which is there hasn't been much data from Rainforest Alliance in a while to know how the premium is lower than the fair trade, is been lower than fair trade in the past, and before it merged with UTZ, which was the major certification body in cocoa, the average premium was less than half of what the fair trade one was. So farmers on the whole who were part of those certified cooperatives were living below the poverty line. But had they not been certified, they would have been slightly worse off. So in a way, it's everyone's going to say of course it's been, certification has been better for me. It's brought me a little bit more income, but it hasn't brought me anywhere close to a living income.
What's the point of having calling it fair trade when it's clearly still not fair trade, like by definition fair?
I think it's fair in the sense that it's better than not having it at all, and it helps form those organized groups that will make it easier to disseminate sustainability programs and get this blockchain technology online. It's far easier to do it with a group of farmers than it is for sets of individuals. It helps form those organizations. So I think that aspect to it it's important. Whether it is entirely entirely fair, as long as people are living below the poverty line and there is
I mean,
still
I think I'd
forests
like
being chopped down and there's still child labor, there's an argument to say it isn't.
I think it's worth pointing out too that okay, we say this farmer he's living on a $1.90 a day. You said right? That's kind of the standard farmer, but
No,
he's
a dollar 90 a day is the international extreme poverty line. The
right
average farmer is earning 90 cents a day.
90 cents a day. Okay, that's even worse. But you've got to take it even further than that and realize that you said the family size is approximately 6 people or something. And if you've got 4 children out there working with you, you're really paying for 5 people on 90 cents a day, right?
Yeah.
That are, as the children are sacrificing their education.
Yeah,
Is it?
but some of those calculations will be divided by the household, divided by the household number, so they'll already have taken into account the household size. So the absolute number may appear larger, but it could be divided by the
Okay, I got you. I got you. So
household number.
they've already accounted for all of the children that are also working in this. I want to switch to coffee for a moment here, and I mean, obviously, I don't think we have time to talk about the whole chain of coffee, um, but when I was in Tanzania, I I had the pleasure of visiting near Arusha, this place, Wild Tracks Coffee. Are you familiar with them? Uh,
I'm not. No. Coffee. I've been covering cocoa for quite a while, but coffee's relatively new for me.
Okay. Well, I expect you or encourage you to check out Wild Tracks. It's actually owned by a Norwegian family, and it's ultra. It's like it's incredibly small, but she's taken the owner and a delightful woman. I can't think of her name right now, but I still get their newsletter since visiting years ago. They have an individual relationship with all of the coffee harvesters, and they encourage them to completely only pick the very best beans, to take the best care of their trees and their everything. And they do charge, and of course Norwegians, they'll pay a little bit more for something they know is totally ethical, and they make sure that all of their workers are well taken care of on that, and then they just pass the premium to the extent that they must on to their clients in Norway. And they only do certain batches a year, maybe 3 times a year or something. And it's enough for one family that has a great marketing angle and dedicated clients and everything else to do that. And it's just the most incredible thing. And of course, the coffee is the greatest coffee you've ever had in your life because it's from the perfect region. It has been so incredibly carefully harvested by people who all care far more about the product, and that they take care of it all the way along. So it was a pleasure to visit with them a few years ago, and I wish that model could be studied and valued, but I don't know how it could be transferred to a large scale to meet the needs of the average citizen for coffee who doesn't live in Norway.
Yeah, and that model that you mentioned, it's a kind of model that you'd like to see in cocoa as well. I'm shifting a bit to my comfort zone
Yeah.
into cocoa, but that similar model you see with some smaller scale manufacturers as well. And the craft chocolate movement, particularly in the US, is growing, and that approach that you're seeing in specialty coffee is also working to some extent in craft chocolate. Yet the industry as a whole is very consolidated. Power is consolidated in just three major suppliers, chocolate ingredient suppliers, and six major brands, each of whom will have, say between 300 to 500,000 farmers that that they're supplying from.
Yeah.
So how do you have all the care and attention to not just to one or two cooperatives that you're working with as a specialty coffee maker or a craft chocolate maker? How do you do that at scale with 300,000? How do you keep the cost low and still ultimately these companies want to be profitable?
In
And
the
that's the
United States, like I'm a consumer of delicious craft beer, actually, and a number of independent craft breweries have gotten together around the country and kind of consolidated some of their distribution lines, and just as an agreement, not as shared ownership necessarily, but they've been able to compete with the big guys because they basically put some of their key resources together. And maybe an association like that could tie together people, farmers who are sick of being manipulated, basically, and say, you know what, we're going to be a co-op and work together.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps in cocoa. There are, the organized sector maybe only accounts in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana for maybe about 50%, or 50%, or maybe less. The majority are smallholder farmers who aren't part of that organized group. I think we mentioned regulation earlier on from, or in trade agreements, origin governments being compelled to do something. I think one approach that hasn't been explored could be to look at a certain region or a landscape area and bring together the local government and different industry players. So you're in one particular region where you have thousands of farmers which aren't currently part of a cooperative. If they were to have the monitoring and evaluation from a hub in that region where people could also sell within that region, where you collect the data for that disorganized sector. All the data that's being collected at the moment is all for the organized sector. It's all for people who are part of cooperatives. It's not on the whole the people who are and this is generalizing a little bit because of course there are cases, but on the whole they're genuinely not the people who are responsible for the vast deforestation or the child labor. Most of that is happening in the disorganized sector. So if you had a hub which was pre-competitive, companies and industry come together to actually map out the boundaries as they're doing for the organized supply chain, but currently there's no real means to reach that disorganized supply chain. Companies are relying on local traders to do that. These local traders who struggle to turn a profit themselves, who have no capacity for this, to have this technology. So it's an issue of money, really, and it would have to come from
outside, somebody to sponsor this initiative. And certainly there are a lot of industry actors who would not be so supportive of the idea because it would kind of cut into their dominance of it. I would like to say thank you so much, Oliver, for joining me. And I want to just ask one more thing. What can end consumers do about it from their perspective? Just somebody who enjoys chocolate, what can they do to help this situation in any way?
It's really tough to vote with your purchases because it's never quite clear, the marketing messages on a chocolate bar, how credible they truly are. Around a quarter of products globally in chocolate, coffee and tea, they'll make a sustainability claim, whether it's on the front of pack or on the manufacturer's website and so on. But to understand what that truly means, and a lot of those there'll be marks, there'll be the Fair Trade mark, the Rainforest Alliance mark,
which is better than nothing.
Which you could argue is better than nothing. It's something, but if you're buying that, the possibilities are that it still may have come from child labor. It still may have come from poverty. It almost certainly will have come from poverty, and it could be responsible for some deforestation. About 40% of Cote d'Ivoire's produce was coming from illegal areas until the law changed recently. 40%.
Can you recommend any brands that people might be able to buy even on the internet that just you have 100% confidence in?
I don't know if I'd go so far as recommending brands, but I think one thing to look out for is to if there is a claim on a cooperative, if you see on the package that they're working with a particular cooperative or it's come from a particular plantation, that usually could mean that there's been post-harvest processing, which will mean it'll taste better, and it could potentially mean that farmers are more fairly remunerated. It's very difficult to tell. I think one that I think it's fair to mention that I did, I think, mention earlier is Tony's Chocolonely, or I think have been quite transparent in their reporting. Even they're finding child labor in their supply chain. I mean, it's just that widespread. I mean, yeah, buy nuts instead.
Buy nuts instead. You're saying the nut industry is better?
No, I'm not. It's just
Maybe if
the nut industry also has child labor in hazelnuts in Turkey. So,
well, if you buy nuts grown in California, for example, pistachios, I guarantee you're going to be happy, and there will be no child labor in that supply chain.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't. I'd really be against any boycotts as well, because it's people's livelihoods as well. So I think it is.
It's your livelihood too, right?
And it's my livelihood. And I do adore chocolate as well. And I wasn't going to name brands, but I might just name the one that I eat, which I do enjoy. It's Ultra Eco, which I don't know if you can get where you are, but
Well, I mean, people are listening, hopefully, from all over the world, so we'll see. Thanks so much again for being a guest. Tell people again, how can they find your podcast?
You go on to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, search for the Sustainable Food and Drink Podcast, and you should find us there.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'll get you in touch with my friend Thomas at ACT. So that's another way that people eventually, it's going to, you pointed out, it's very challenging to follow the ethical and sustainability of food that you're buying. And so that's what his product is hoping to do and make it a little clearer. But chocolate is going to be a challenge, right?
It'll take time, I think. But I think it's moving in the right direction. It's just the pace that it's moving, and I think legislation would speed that up. Some of the technology and adoption will speed that up, but it's unfortunately going to be slow.
All right. Well,
arduous progress, I think.
We'll get there. Take care, my friend.
Thank you very much.